For 8 seasons from 1964 to 1972, American television watched a beautiful witch named Samantha twitch her nose and cast spells. She was married to an ordinary mortal named Darrin Stephens, an advertising executive. Couple lived in a suburban home where Samantha had to hide her true identity, suppress her magical powers, and pretend to be a normal housewife. Show was called Bewitched, and it became a cultural phenomenon. It ran for 254 episodes. It was nominated for multiple Emmy Awards, made millions of people laugh every single week. It became the #2 show in America behind only Bonanza. Families tuned in together to watch the magical chaos that ensued whenever Samantha could not resist using her powers, and the lengths she and Darrin would go to keep her secret hidden from the mortal world. But behind the scenes, cast of Bewitched was living under a very real curse. Not the magical kind that Samantha could fix with a twitch of her nose. A curse of tragedy, illness, addiction, and early death. So pervasive, so consistent, and so devastating that multiple cast members and crew would later speak openly about the idea that the show itself was cursed. This is the true story of what happened to the cast of Bewitched, and it is far darker than anything that happened in any episode of the show. Bewitched premiered on ABC on September 18, 1964. It was created by Solsax and starred Elizabeth Montgomery as Samantha Stephens, the beautiful witch with a twitch. The show also featured Dick York as Darrin Stephens, Agnes Moorehead as Samantha's meddling mother Endora, and a supporting cast that included Paul Lynde, Marion Lorne, and others. For the first 5 seasons of the show, Dick York played Darrin Stephens. He was charming, he was funny, he had genuine chemistry with Elizabeth Montgomery. The two of them together made Bewitched work. But something terrible was happening to Dick York that nobody knew about. Years before Bewitched in 1959, Dick York was filming a western called They Came to Cordura. During a scene, was among several men lifting a railroad handcar onto a rail. When the director yelled cut, everyone was supposed to let go. But Dick York did not hear the word, he held on. And suddenly, an extra who was still on the car reached up, grabbed the rail. York was jerked up by his grip. Instead of lifting the expected weight, York found himself suddenly lifting the entire weight of the extra off the ground. 180 pounds or so, all of his force, transferred directly through Dick York's back. The muscles along the right side of his back tore. They snapped and let loose. His spine was wrenched. It was the beginning of a pain that would never end. York did not go to a doctor. He thought he was tough. He thought he would heal. Thought that a young man's body could bounce back from anything. He was wrong. Over the following years, as he worked on television and in films, pain never went away. It got worse. His spinal discs began to fail. His back became increasingly unstable. When he was cast on Bewitched, he was already a man in constant, severe pain, but he could not let anyone know. The show required him to do physical stunts. Had to fall out of chairs. He had to chase Samantha around the house. Had to do all the things that an advertising executive would do in a sitcom. And every single moment of every single day, he was in agony. To manage the pain, York started taking pills. Pain medication, lots of pain medication, and because the pain never went away, had to keep taking them. By the time the show became a massive hit in its 2nd and 3rd seasons, York was dependent on prescription painkillers. He was medicating himself to continue working. Some days, he was so loopy from the medication that other cast members noticed. There were reports that he was difficult to work with. He was strange on set, that his behavior was unpredictable, but they did not know that every movement of his body was sending waves of pain through his nervous system, and the only way he could function was by remaining chemically sedated. As time went on, the situation got worse. York began to supplement his prescription pills with alcohol to dull the pain even further. He was in pain when he woke up, was in pain when he worked. He was in pain when he went to bed. The pills and alcohol were not enough to make the pain stop, only made it so he could almost function. By the middle of the 1960s, York was a man physically and chemically devastated by a single moment in time that he had never properly addressed. The longer the show went on, worse his condition became. In the middle of filming season 6 in 1969, Dick York collapsed on the set. He was hospitalized. Producer William Asher prepared himself to fire the man who had made the show what it was. But York, with whatever dignity remained to him, told Asher that he wanted to quit. He did not want to be fired. He did not want to let anyone down by forcing them into the terrible position of having to let him go. So Dick York walked away from Bewitched mid-season in 1969. He was replaced by an actor named Dick Sargent, who would play Darrin Stephens for the final 3 seasons of the show. After Bewitched, Dick York's life became increasingly difficult. Could barely work. The medications and alcohol had left him dependent on a cocktail of substances just to get through the day. His career never recovered. By the 1970s, he was doing small guest roles in television. By the 1980s, he was almost unemployed. He and his wife Joan moved from California to Michigan to live off her inheritance and a small pension from the Screen Actors Guild. He was financially devastated. He was physically devastated. He was a man who had spent 8 years performing for millions of people while secretly suffering in ways that no one could see. Dick York died on February 20, 1992 at age 63. Back injury that he sustained in 1959 had slowly, inexorably destroyed his life. And for all of that time, from 1959 to 1992, never fully recovered. If Dick York's story was one of hidden pain, Dick Sargent's story was one of hidden truth. Sargent was actually the original choice to play Darrin Stephens when Bewitched was being cast in 1964. Due to contractual obligations to Universal Studios, he was not available, so Dick York got the role. But fate had other plans. Years later, when York had to leave the show, Sargent finally got his chance. He stepped into the role for the final 3 seasons, from 1969 to 1972. And if viewers noticed that Darrin looked different, ABC offered no explanation. The network simply replaced him without comment, as if nothing had happened. What most viewers never knew was that Dick Sargent was living a double life. He was a closeted gay man in an era when being openly gay could destroy a career. Sargent spent decades hiding who he really was, conforming to the expectations of Hollywood heterosexuality, and living in silence about the person he truly loved. For 20 years, he was in a relationship with a man he could only publicly call a business associate. When that man died, Sargent was devastated, but he could not publicly mourn. He could not tell the world that he had lost the love of his life. Had to pretend that he had just lost a colleague. By 1989, Sargent was diagnosed with prostate cancer. His health was deteriorating, and as the disease progressed, Sargent made a difficult decision. He decided that he could not live in silence anymore, could not die in the closet. On October 11, 1991, National Coming Out Day, Dick Sargent publicly declared that he was gay, told the world that he had been hiding his sexuality for his entire career. The announcement shocked Hollywood, but it also inspired many people who saw in Sargent a man who had found the courage to finally be honest about who he was, even as his body was failing him. In June of 1992, Dick Sargent marched as a Grand Marshal of the Los Angeles Gay Pride Parade with Elizabeth Montgomery by his side, offering public support for the man who had played her husband on television. It was a beautiful moment of solidarity, but it came too late for Sargent's health. He died of prostate cancer on July 8, 1994, at age 64. He had spent most of his life hiding. Even though he found the courage to tell the truth in his final years, the truth could not save him. The cast of Bewitched was not just plagued by hidden pain and hidden truth, it was also touched by a darkness so mysterious that it would cast a shadow over the entire production. Agnes Moorehead, played Samantha's mother Endora, was one of the greatest character actresses of her generation. She had been a member of Orson Welles' Mercury Theater. She had appeared in Citizen Kane. She had been nominated for multiple Academy Awards. By the time she joined Bewitched, she was already a legend. But what she did not know was that a decision she had made years earlier would eventually kill her. In 1954, Agnes Moorehead had filmed a movie called The Conqueror. It was a Western starring John Wayne as Genghis Khan. Film was shot in the Utah desert near St. George, not far from an area where the U.S. government had been conducting atomic bomb testing. Radiation from those tests had not yet been cleaned up. The cast and crew of The Conqueror were exposed to radioactive fallout, though at the time they had no idea what they were breathing, what they were drinking, or how deeply the radiation was penetrating their bodies. In the decades that followed, something uncanny and tragic began to happen. The cast and crew of The Conqueror started developing cancer. John Wayne developed cancer and died. Susan Hayward developed cancer and died. Pedro Armendariz developed cancer and killed himself rather than face a slow death. And Agnes Moorehead developed uterine cancer. By 1980, federal government estimated that out of approximately 120 people who had worked on The Conqueror, only one of them had developed some form of cancer. 46 had died from it. Agnes Moorehead was diagnosed with uterine cancer in 1972, just as Bewitched was ending its run. She spent the next 2 years fighting the disease. She filmed her final episodes of Bewitched while knowing that she was dying. On April 30, 1974, Agnes Moorehead died in Rochester, Minnesota, at age 73. She had kept her diagnosis quiet. She had not made a fuss. She had simply worked, and then she had died, leaving behind a legacy of more than 60 years in the entertainment industry. The woman who played a witch with supernatural powers, who made people laugh with her magical meddling, had been killed by forces far more real and far more sinister than any magic. She had been killed by the invisible poison of atomic radiation, exposure that happened 20 years before she ever became famous as Endora. If Agnes Moorehead's death was mysterious and tragic, Elizabeth Montgomery's death was perhaps the most shocking of all. Elizabeth Montgomery was the heart of Bewitched. She was Samantha Stephens. She was the star. She was the reason the show worked. Chemistry between her and Dick York in the early seasons was electric. She made millions of people believe in the possibility of magic. After Bewitched ended in 1972, She went on to have a long and successful career in television movies. She earned 9 Emmy nominations. She was the producer of her own projects. She was powerful, talented, and beloved. But in March of 1995, Elizabeth Montgomery made a discovery that would change everything. She had been diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. Disease was already advanced. She had been ignoring symptoms, pushing through with her life, assuming that whatever was wrong would eventually go away. But by the time she sought medical treatment, the cancer had spread. She had perhaps 3 months to live. She had weeks to prepare for death. She told only her closest family and friends. She did not make any public announcements. She did not give interviews. She simply prepared to die. On May 18, 1995, at her home in Beverly Hills, Elizabeth Montgomery died of cancer. She was 62 years old. The woman who had made television magic was gone. She had been the youngest, healthiest, the most vibrant member of the Bewitched cast. And she had been taken first. In less than a decade, 5 of the main cast members of Bewitched had been touched by serious illness and death. Dick York, crippled by chronic pain and addiction, dead at 63. Dick Sargent, hidden behind a closeted lie for decades, dead of cancer at 64. Agnes Moorehead, her body slowly poisoned by atomic radiation, dead at 73. Elizabeth Montgomery, seemingly healthy, struck down by cancer, dead at 62. And the show itself, which had run for only 8 seasons and ended over 20 years ago, continued to cast a shadow over everyone who had been part of it. People began to whisper about a curse. Was there something about the show itself that brought misfortune? Were the roles somehow hexed, cursed by the very magic they depicted? Was there something about playing a witch, or marrying a witch, or being married to someone who played a witch, brought real tragedy into the lives of the actors? These were desperate questions, born of grief and desperation. They reflected a real pattern of suffering that could not be ignored. The truth is probably more complicated. Show was created in an era before workplace safety standards were as strict as they are today. Rigorous physical demands placed on Dick York eventually broke his body. Social constraints of Hollywood at the time forced Dick Sargent to hide his true identity for decades. Agnes Moorehead's exposure to atomic radiation had nothing to do with Bewitched itself, but it haunted the show with an almost mythical quality. And Elizabeth Montgomery's cancer was a terrible tragedy. But cancer is not unique to Bewitched. It strikes people in every profession, every circumstance, at every age. But what connected all of these tragedies was that they happened to people who were part of a show that was about hiding truth, about suppressing identity, about keeping secrets. Samantha had to hide what she really was. Sargent had to hide what he really was. Dick York had to hide his pain. Agnes Moorehead had to hide her illness. Elizabeth Montgomery hid her cancer until it was almost too late. Real curse of Bewitched was not a magical curse. It was the curse of suffering in silence. It was the curse of hidden pain, hidden identity, hidden illness, hidden truth. The cast of Bewitched had to perform perfection every single day. They had to pretend that everything was fine, had to keep their struggles to themselves, and slowly, those struggles destroyed them. Today, over 50 years after Bewitched went off the air, show remains in syndication. New generations of people continue to discover it, fall in love with it, and experience the magic that Elizabeth Montgomery and Dick York created together. The show has outlasted all of the tragedy. It has outlasted all of the suffering. But the cast members who brought that magic to life have long since passed on, taking their secrets with them. Bewitched was a show about a woman hiding her true self from the world. It was also a show created by cast members who were hiding their true selves from the world. And perhaps that is why the show resonated so deeply with audiences. Perhaps that is why, even today, people feel drawn to Bewitched. Because on some level, they understood that the magic on the screen was created by real people struggling with very real problems. And somehow, despite their suffering, they created something beautiful. Which Bewitched cast member's story affected you most? The invisible pain of Dick York? Hidden truth of Dick Sargent? The mysterious radiation that killed Agnes Moorehead? The shocking cancer diagnosis of Elizabeth Montgomery? Comment below and share which tragedy moved you most deeply. Because remembering these stories and honoring the people who lived through them is the only way to ensure that their suffering was not in vain.